إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So carrying on then with the fiqh of Ramadan, the first hadith we have today is the hadith of Abu Huraira رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من نسي وهو صائم فأكل أو شرب فليتم صومه فإنما أطعمه الله وسقاه متفق عليه. This hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, he says that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, whoever forgets whilst he is fasting and eats or drinks, then he must continue and finish his fast. Because indeed that is Allah who provided him the food and drink. The hadith is highlighting then that if a person forgetfully eats and drinks, it doesn't break your fast. If somebody eats or drinks on purpose, then of course we know that invalidates the fast. If somebody eats or drinks on purpose, that invalidates the fast. Because in the Quran Allah mentioned, وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ ثُمَّ أَتِمُّوا الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ. Allah said, eat and drink until the white line becomes clear from the black line. Then fast up until the evening. When this ayah was revealed about the black line and the white line, that you can eat and drink until the white line is distinguishable from the black line, one of the companions took two pieces of string, a black string and a white string, and put them under his pillow. And when it came to near Fajr time, he kept looking under his pillow to see if he could tell the difference between the black string and the white string. Because of course in pitch black darkness of the night, no lights, very difficult to tell which one is the white one, which one is the black one. So he kept looking to see if he could determine which one is which. Until eventually when it starts to get light, you can tell. So when the Prophet ﷺ heard about that, he explained to him that is not the intended meaning of the ayah. It is not that you have to try to distinguish like that. The Prophet explained to him the meaning is actually the white line of dawn, of Fajr, distinguishing that from the blackness of the night. So you can eat and drink up until that white line appears, meaning Fajr time enters. So once Fajr time enters, then it is not permissible to eat or drink up until Maghrib. So if somebody eats or drinks on purpose during that time, then of course it invalidates your fast. But the hadith here is telling us if you do it completely by accident, forgetfully, that doesn't break your fast. Because as it mentions in the Quran as well, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَّسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. Our Lord, do not hold us accountable if we make a mistake, or if we forget or make a mistake. So forgetfulness is not held accountable upon a person. The ruling though is that if you forget and eat, that as soon as you remember, you must immediately stop eating. Even if you were eating something and you took a bite and then you remembered you're fasting, it's Ramadan, even the bite that you've taken, you have to get it out of your mouth. You cannot swallow anything else after you remember that you are fasting. Even the bite in your mouth, you have to get rid of it. If you remember now that you're fasting, because if you swallow that bite after you remembered, then that means you've eaten that on purpose now. You had remembered you were fasting and you still carried on biting and swallowing that food. That's counted as being on purpose then. So you must stop immediately when you remember and get rid of it. And the fast still counts for that person even if you ended up eating a meal. The fast would still count and you finish it for the rest of the day and you don't have to make up that day afterwards. The next hadith, also Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من ذرعه القيء فلا قضاء عليه ومن استقاء فعليه القضاء. That whoever is overcome by vomiting, then you don't have to make up a day. But whoever makes themselves vomit on purpose, then you have to make up that day. So this is now talking about the issue of vomiting. If a person ends up vomiting, does it break their fast or not? So the hadith is highlighting that if you're feeling ill, you're not feeling good, and you can't help it, you end up vomiting. Out of no choice, you just feel so bad, you end up vomiting. So in that scenario, it wasn't your fault, you didn't do it on purpose, you were just sick, and you felt bad, and you couldn't control it, you ended up vomiting. That doesn't break your fast. And you can carry on for the rest of the day if you're fit and healthy enough. If you're too sick, you can just break it anyway. But if you're okay actually, even after vomiting now, you're actually okay and you can carry on, then carry on and the day still counts. That vomit doesn't break your fast. However, if a person makes themselves vomit on purpose, that breaks your fast and you have to make up that day again afterwards. A person might make themselves vomit on purpose. It's possible because you know when you vomit, then you actually feel better afterwards. Before vomiting, a person may feel really sick and may feel really bad. But after you vomit and get rid of the contents of your stomach, then a person may actually feel a bit better sometimes. So maybe a person is feeling really unwell and they want to vomit out that food. So they do something to make themselves vomit. Maybe by just poking their finger into their throat or some other object into their throat to make themselves vomit. Or maybe it doesn't have to be something physical. Maybe they go and smell something which is a really bad smell on purpose, and that makes them vomit. That can make you vomit. By smelling something really disgusting, it could make you vomit, especially if you're not feeling well. Or by looking at something disgusting. Maybe a person looks at something disgusting, maybe, as somebody said in another class, a dead animal. Maybe there's a dead rat. And so you look at that dead rat and that sight makes you vomit. So if you look at something or smell something or physically do something to make yourself vomit, then you have to make up that day afterwards. But if you don't do anything, you're just not feeling well and you can't control it and you vomit, that day still counts like that. If you want to carry on, you're able to carry on, you can carry on and it counts. It doesn't break your fast if it's unintentional. Then, the next two hadith are on the topic of traveling. What are the rulings of fasting when you are traveling? So, there are two hadith here to take into consideration. The first one is the hadith of Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma. أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خرج عام الفتح إلى مكة في رمضان فصام حتى بلغ كراع الغميم فصام الناس ثم دعا بقدح من ماء فرفعه حتى نظر الناس إليه ثم شرب فقيل له بعد ذلك إن بعض الناس قد صام فقال أولئك العصاة وفي لفظ إن بعض الناس قد شق عليهم الصيام وإنما ينتظرون فيما فعلت فدعا بقدح من ماء بعد العصر فشربه رواه مسلم. This first hadith tells us that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam left Medina to go to Mecca in the year of the conquering of Mecca. So you know, of course, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born and raised in Mecca and became a prophet in Mecca, but then was forced out and had to do the hijrah to Medina. When the hijrah was done to Medina, that year is the first year of the Islamic calendar. That's where it starts, from the hijrah. So right now we're in what year of the Islamic calendar? 1446. 1446 years since the hijrah was done. That's where the calendar begins from. So when the Prophet did the hijrah from Medina to Mecca, from Mecca to Medina, when the Prophet did the hijrah with the Muslims from Mecca to Medina, how many years after that were the Muslims now powerful enough to return back to Mecca and conquer Mecca? What year did they go back? Anyone know?
12.
In the year 12 is impossible because the Prophet died in the year...
Were they not there for 13 years?
No, other way around. The Prophet was in Mecca for 13 years.
I said 9 then.
Almost. So the Prophet was in Mecca for 13 years, then moved to Medina and lived there for another 10 years, and then died. So 9 Hijri is close. It was actually 8 Hijri. So 8 years after the Hijrah, the Muslims now had the ability and they returned back and conquered Mecca. That actually happened, or they left in Ramadan. It was in Ramadan they headed out from Medina to go to Mecca for the conquering of Mecca. It was in Ramadan when they headed out. So on the day that they headed out, They were all fasting. They headed out at some point after Fajr. So they were in Medina for suhoor time, for Fajr time. They were fasting in the morning. Then later on that morning, at some point, they headed out towards Mecca. So as they headed out to Mecca, they were all fasting. They were all fasting. The Prophet was fasting and all the rest of the companions were fasting. And imagine in those days, from Medina to Mecca, over 200 miles, like from here to London, walking on their camels and donkeys and walking like that. Desert, 40, 50 degrees, and they were fasting and they headed out. So as they headed out, they continued on their journey until they arrived at a place called Qura' al-Ghamim. And everybody was fasting yet. And this was almost Asr time, it says in one narration, around about Asr time. So all day they'd been traveling in the dust and the deserts with their camels and donkeys, and all day traveling along, who knows how many miles they had covered by them in the heat, 30, 40, 50 degrees. And at Asr time, they got to this place, Qura' al-Ghamim, en route. It says in one of the narrations that some of the companions came to the Prophet and they said to him, Messenger of Allah, fasting has become a great difficulty. We're struggling basically. We're struggling. And everybody's just waiting to see what you're going to do, because we're all struggling. So the Prophet ﷺ ordered for like a bowl or some kind of vessel of water to be brought to him. So when this water came to him, he lifted it up to show everybody. There were a large group of them, of course, to show them all, and in front of them all he drank it. And this was around about Asr time. So it wasn't time to open the fast, wasn't Maghrib, it was Asr approximately. He opened his fast in front of them all. So they all saw that the messenger is no longer fasting. He has opened his fast because they were traveling. So now they all knew that the ruling is we can open our fast because we're traveling. So they opened their fasts. Except a few of them. A few of them didn't open their fast. They insisted on continuing the fast. So when some others came and told the Prophet that, Messenger, some of them are still fasting. They didn't open it. A few didn't open it. The Messenger said, they are disobedient. They are disobedient. That is the first hadith. It tells us about how they were heading out to Mecca in the year when they conquered Mecca, and it was in Ramadan, and they were fasting, and on the route it became obviously very difficult, and some of the companions came and told the messenger, so he drank some water in front of them all to show them that you can open your fasts, and they did, except a few of them didn't. But when the messenger found out, he said they are disobedient. According to this hadith then, it would seem to indicate that when you're traveling, you should or shouldn't fast? Shouldn't. Because the messenger opened his fast, and the ones who hadn't, the messenger said about them that they are disobedient. That's wrong, sinners. Disobedient for not opening their fast. So this hadith would seem to indicate that you shouldn't fast when you're traveling. In the Quran, Allah mentions, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ, that whomsoever from among you is sick or traveling, then make up a number of days elsewhere, meaning miss those days and make them up after Eid. So the first hadith is indicating to us that you shouldn't fast when you're traveling. And they were disobedient, the ones who did. But then we have this other hadith here. عن حمزة ابن عمرو الأسلمي رضي الله عنه أنه قال يا رسول الله أجد بي قوة على الصيام في السفر فهل علي جناح؟ فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم هي رخصة من الله فمن أخذها أو أخذ بها فحسن ومن أحب أن يصوم فلا جناح عليه رواه Muslim. Then we have this hadith in Sahih Muslim of Hamza ibn Amr al-Aslami, one of the companions, radiyallahu anh. He came to the messenger one time and said to the messenger, O messenger of Allah, I find within myself strength to be able to fast when I'm traveling. I have the strength. I can do it. It's not a problem for me to fast when I'm traveling. So is there any sin upon me or anything wrong if I do fast when I'm traveling? Because I'm capable. So the messenger said to him, it is a permission that Allah has given you to miss the fast when you're traveling. That's a permission Allah has given you. It's an allowance Allah has given you to miss when you're traveling. So whoever takes that allowance, then that is good. But whoever wishes to fast when traveling, then there's nothing wrong. No sin upon him. So this hadith seems to indicate that actually when you're traveling, it's not a problem if you want to fast. The messenger said to him, whoever wants to fast, then it's not a problem. But in the first one, the messenger said they were disobedient. So the first one is indicating you shouldn't, the second one is indicating you can. So how do we combine between the two narrations? Should you fast when you're traveling or should you not?
I think you have a choice.
But then what about the messenger saying you're disobedient? Why didn't they have a choice?
Because that was very hard for them that time. They was walking.
Exactly. It comes down to the issue of burden. If the journey is burdensome, it's a difficult travel, a difficult journey, which places hardship on you, hardship and difficulty on you, then in that scenario, the first hadith applies, that you should not fast in that case. Don't try and fast in that case when it's such a burden, such a difficulty, such a hardship, and you're creating so many problems for yourself. In that kind of situation, if you're traveling like that, then you should not fast. But in the second hadith, it's talking more about a situation when you're traveling and there is no real burden. It's a relaxed journey. Aeroplane these days, maybe, not necessarily. But it depends. For each person, it could be different. For some people, an aeroplane journey may be comfortable, no problem, they can fast. Other people may decide an aeroplane journey is actually burdensome. And it could be. If you think about you're going to leave your home, maybe you have to drive an hour to get to the airport to begin with. Then you have to sit around in the airport, standard economy people, sitting around in the metal chairs, if you find one, standing up otherwise, walking around 2 hours before your flight, security queues. Then you get into the plane, and even if you're in first class, no difference. In the plane, everybody knows if you travel, the dry air inside of an aeroplane dries out your skin, dries out the moisture. If it's a long flight, that could be a difficulty in and of itself. So it depends. A person may think that a plane journey is actually difficult. And that would be an arguable case. But some people may say, no, it's nothing, I travel all the time. Some people do. Some people live in London and they work in Paris. Fly out every day, work and fly back home again. It's known. People do that. So some people may say it's no big deal. But it depends. The point is, if you're on a journey which is considered light for you, it's not a big deal, then in that situation you have the choice. If you want, you can still just miss the fast. Even if it's a light journey, doesn't matter, you can still miss the fast. Because the Prophet did say it is an allowance Allah has given you. Whoever takes that allowance, that's good. So even if the journey is minor for you, but if you miss the fast that day, you've taken the allowance Allah gave, and that's good. But if a person decides, well, it's so minor the journey, it's not even a problem for me, it's 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, but it's minor to me, and I'll just fast, then you can do that. Yes, person says, I'll just fast, they can do that. And that isn't something wrong in that situation. So it's all about the burden and the ability. If it's too burdensome and you don't really have the ability, it's a hardship, you shouldn't fast. If it's not really burdensome and you have the ability, then you have a choice. So in the situation where it's a burden, there's no choice, you shouldn't fast. But in the situation where it's not a burden, you have a choice. But the question then is, which one is the better choice? When you're in a situation and the journey isn't a burden for you, it's a journey, it is a journey, but it's not a burden for you, then what is the better choice for you to make? Should you fast or should you not?
You should not.
You should not? Why not?
Because of the hadith where whoever acts upon you has done good.
Alright, because when Hamza ibn Amr al-Aslami radiyallahu anhu said to the Prophet that I'm basically fit and healthy and capable and I have strength, I can fast even when I'm traveling. And in those days, the traveling was the same in the deserts on the camels and donkeys and horses, that kind of traveling. And he was saying it's not a problem for me. Even with that, I can fast. It's not a burden, it doesn't cause me any problems as such. The messenger still said to him, it's a license Allah has given you though, it's an allowance Allah has given you to miss the fast still. So if you take that, it is a good thing. But if you don't want to, then that's okay as well, you can fast. So the messenger did say, it's an allowance that you should take, and that's a good thing. In another hadith it mentions, Inna Allah yuhibbu an tu'ta rukhaso. Allah loves that you take the allowances that He gives you. So maybe based upon those narrations, you could argue that it's better to still miss it anyway, even if you're capable and it's a minor journey for you. But other scholars, they say it's better in that case when it's minor, it's not a problem, that you should just keep it, fast. And one of the arguments they use is, fasting in Ramadan, are these obligatory or optional fasts? Obligatory fasts. And if you miss one, then you have to make it up. So in that situation where it's a minor journey, if you choose to miss it, which is allowed, it now means you're putting yourself into debt. You're putting yourself into debt because that day or 2 or 3 days, whatever the travel is, you're going to have to make them up after Eid. You have now put yourself into debt on an obligatory act of worship. They say if you can avoid putting yourself into debt on obligatory acts of worship, then surely that's better. Fulfill the obligation there and then, better than putting yourself in debt with an obligation for later on. So some scholars, they say, if you're capable, then just do it. Why are you going to put yourself in debt on purpose with an obligation, and who knows what happens afterwards? Who knows what might happen after Eid, whether you become sick or other things. Why have that burden on your shoulder as a debt for afterwards? If you're capable of doing it right now, it's better to fulfill the obligation right now, rather than making the obligation into a debt, which again is a logical reasoning. It's a sound reasoning.
But if Allah is allowing, giving allowance, so if you die, probably Allah will forgive you for that one.
No, of course you will be. If you have the allowance and you miss it and then you die on Eid day, so you never made up that fast, you're not a sinner. There's no sin upon you. Because when you miss fasts, in the Sunnah we know you're allowed to make them up any time up until next Ramadan. You've got a whole year to make them up any time. Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet, sometimes when she had days left to make up, she said she would make them up just a few weeks before the next Ramadan. Like now. She would make them up just before the next Ramadan came in sometimes. So it's allowed to make them up any time before the next Ramadan. So you wouldn't be a sinner, you're right. So these are differences of opinion though. Some scholars have this opinion, some scholars have that opinion. Because the Messenger did say to him, whoever wants to fast, no problem. Messenger said, no problem. So it is allowed. It is allowed to do for the one who wishes to do that. Then, we'll just finish off maybe on this one. عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما قال. This hadith now is the hadith of Ibn Abbas رضي الله تعالى عنهما. He said, رخص للشيخ الكبير أن يفطر. That it is allowed for somebody elderly in age to miss their fasting. وَيُطْعِمُ عَنْ كُلِّ يَوْمٍ مِسْكِينًا وَلَا قَضَاءَ عَلَيْهِ. And he can feed a poor person for every day and he doesn't have to make those days up. This is now talking about someone who is old in age and no longer has the capacity to fast. Physically, their health, their body, they're so old now, they just can't fast anymore. They no longer have the capacity to fast. So now that kind of person obviously then is allowed to miss the fasting. The Sharia gives the allowance. Somebody who is no longer capable of fasting due to old age and weakness and lack of strength, etc., can miss the fasting then. But the ruling for that person obviously isn't that they have to make them up after Ramadan. That can't be. That's impossible. Because if they are missing their fasting in Ramadan due to old age and weakness, then after Ramadan they're going to be even older. They're going to be a month older. Or maybe even a bit more weaker. So there's no possibility of them making up the fasts. Instead, for those kinds of people, they simply have to feed a poor person for every day that they miss. Nisfu sa', half of a sa'. I forgot what that is in kilograms, a couple of kilograms or something. The amount which is a meal for the day. So that must be given for every day, a kilogram and a half. A kilogram and a half pretty much. So that must be given every day for the days that the person misses, the elderly person. That's in the Quran. The ruling is in the Quran. وَعَلَى الَّذِينَ يُطِيقُونَهُ فِدْيَةٌ طَعَامُ مِسْكِينٍ. Those who are no longer capable of it, then they give a fidya, the food for the poor person for every day. So now, over these hadith that we've covered, we have now understood that there are 4 different types of people who are allowed to miss fasting. 4 different types of people who are allowed to miss fasting. In no particular order. Number 1, traveler. A traveler is allowed to miss fasting. Or sometimes he may have to miss it if it's in a situation of burden and he can't handle the journey, etc. He shouldn't fast. So a traveler. Secondly, an old person, somebody who is very old is allowed to miss the fasting because they no longer have the capacity to fast. Thirdly, somebody sick is allowed to miss the fasting. Fourthly, we haven't discussed, but who else obviously cannot fast? Woman on the period and the menstruating woman, that will come to in a minute. So the woman on the period or on the postpartum, the postnatal bleeding after childbirth, they can definitely miss, they are not allowed to fast. 4 types of people. The rulings on these 4 types of people, well, either it's going to be you have to make it up, or it's going to be the fidya. 2 rulings. So the traveler, which one is the ruling for the traveler? Make it up afterwards. The elderly person, what's the ruling? Fidya. Give the food for the poor person. The sick person, what's the ruling?
Depends on the sickness.
Depends, because there are 2 types of sicknesses. One is the temporary sickness, where you are expected to recover and get back to health. And one is the chronic illness, maybe something which basically, they say in fiqh, a sickness that you are not expected to recover from and get back to health. It's a permanent sickness. So you have a temporary sickness. Somebody gets a fever for a few days, you miss a few days of Ramadan, make it up afterwards. But somebody has a permanent sickness. Some people, maybe they have some organ issues and they can't fast. Doctors have told them, you cannot fast because of these issues they have in their health, their organs, whatever it is. So they can't fast. For the rest of their lives, they can't fast because they have this permanent health problem. So if you have a temporary health problem, you get sick for a few days or whatever it is, the ruling is you make up the days when you get better. But if you have a permanent health issue that prevents you from fasting, then the ruling is fidya, because you can't tell that person to make up the days. His illness, his health issue is permanent. So when's he going to make them up? He can't. So the sick person depends. Temporary sickness, make up the days. Permanent sickness, fidya. The woman on the period and postnatal bleeding, make it up. The ruling is make it up. After Eid, she simply makes up those days at whatever time. After the bleeding finishes of childbirth, she simply makes up those days afterwards. Then somebody mentioned the pregnant woman. And you could also add to that the woman who is feeding her child. What's the ruling on those 2 situations? The woman who is breastfeeding her child and the woman who is pregnant.
If there's no harm to the child, then she's allowed to fast. If there's potential harm, she's not.
So the 4 categories we mentioned so far, the traveler, the sick person, the elderly, and the woman on the period or postnatal bleeding, they are automatically allowed to miss fasting. If you're a traveler, automatically you're allowed to miss if you want. Elderly no longer has the capacity, khalas, they can miss the fasting and they give the fidya. Somebody sick with a sickness that will either what's the ruling of a sickness? Not any sickness you can miss fasting with. If you have a little cold or something, you shouldn't miss fasting. Sickness to miss fasting is a sickness whereby if you were to fast, it would extend the recovery time or it increases the harm upon you. So if you got some kind of illness and if you were to fast during that illness, and it wouldn't increase the time period for you to get better, it wouldn't increase how long it takes for you to get better if you fasted, neither does it cause you any pain or harm to fast, then in that case you're supposed to fast. The sickness is only allowed to miss fasting if you're going to take longer to get better then, or it's going to increase the harm and pain, etc. on you. So the point there is, with the sickness, if you're at that kind of level, then you can automatically miss the fasting. And the period woman and postnatal automatically cannot even fast. But the woman who is pregnant and breastfeeding, there is no automatic excuse to miss fasting. A woman can't say, I'm pregnant, therefore I'm not going to fast. Whereas somebody traveling can say, I'm traveling today, therefore I'm not going to fast. Okay. I'm old in age, I'm no longer capable, therefore I'm not going to fast. Okay. I'm on the period or postnatal bleeding, therefore I'm not going to fast. Okay. I'm sick with that kind of level of sickness we explained, so I'm not going to fast. Okay. But a woman who's pregnant or breastfeeding can't just say, I'm pregnant or I'm breastfeeding, therefore I'm not going to fast. The rule doesn't work for them too. For those two, it depends on certain issues. And basically depends on two things. The woman who's breastfeeding or pregnant, if she fasts, will it harm her child or herself? Meaning, if there is no harm on the child or herself, then she has no excuse to miss fasting. She has to fast. Medically, if the doctors, they tell her you're maybe in the early stages of pregnancy, very early, the fasts are quite short, it wouldn't actually make any difference. It's not going to harm you or the baby. You can fast if you want. Then in that case, Islamically speaking, she has to fast. She can't say, oh, but I'm pregnant, though I'm going to miss anyway. A lot of the scholars, they say, if there is no harm to you or the baby, then you have to fast. Why are you not fasting then? If there is a harm to you or the baby, which probably is going to be in most cases. So most pregnant and breastfeeding women aren't going to fast because there would be some detrimental effect to yourself or to the baby. So in that case, you're allowed to miss fasting if there is going to be some negative impact on yourself or the baby. But then the question is, let's assume now the pregnant or the breastfeeding woman misses the fasting because there's some harm upon herself or the baby, then what's the ruling afterwards? Make it up.
So the feeding can go up to 2 years, so what if it gets to the next Ramadan before?
It's okay, after that Ramadan then.
Okay. No.
She's alive,
So what then? Fidya? That's the only other option. There is a difference of opinion between the scholars on this issue. In detail, there's quite a lot of detail because the scholars, they say if she misses the fasting because there's harm on her, then it's one ruling. If she misses the fasting because there's harm on the baby, it's another ruling, but we won't get into all that. Basically, they say then, some scholars say she has to just make up the days afterwards. Others, they say no, she can just give the fidya, she doesn't have to make up the days. The ones who say she can just give the fidya, she doesn't have to make up the days, they do have some evidences. There are some evidences. There is a narration of Ibn Abbas, one of the companions, who indicated that ruling. So it is possible, there are some narrations. Shaykh al-Albani has that opinion. Other scholars though, they say no, she has to make up those days. And their logic is that the pregnant or breastfeeding woman which category is she most closest to? The traveler and the person who's temporarily sick, both of their excuses to miss fasting are temporary or permanent? Temporary, a traveler traveling for a couple of days a week, somebody sick for a couple of days or a week, it's a temporary excuse. They're allowed to miss for those days and they make them up because it's only temporary. Somebody old in age or permanent illness or those kinds of reasons, is that temporary or permanent? Permanent, so their ruling is they have to just give fidya. Pregnant woman and breastfeeding woman, is her excuse temporary or permanent? Temporary. It's temporary. So if it's temporary, the ruling for temporary people is they have to make it up afterwards.
But what if she gets pregnant consecutively again and again?
That's so much. She's not going to get to 70-year-old. She's going to keep it.
So technically now then, it is temporary. So that should mean that she has to make up the days, just like the traveler and the sick person temporarily. But maybe somebody could say, well, it's possible she could end up almost like a permanent issue. Imagine a woman now is pregnant, misses Ramadan. Then the next 2 years after that, she's breastfeeding, misses another 2 years. Then she gets pregnant again, and then she breastfeeds again, then she gets pregnant again and breastfeeds again. That's a decade gone. A decade where she's legitimately allowed to miss every Ramadan. Because she's either pregnant or she's breastfeeding and she has a problem for herself or the baby. So legitimately she can miss a decade perhaps. Maybe even longer. So now at the end, eventually there's going to come a time where she's no longer pregnant. So then maybe now she's 45 years old, for example. And she's not getting pregnant now. But she's missed 20 Ramadans. From the age of 20, 25 to 45, whatever it was, she's ended up missing 20 Ramadans. Every couple of years, pregnant, breastfeeding, mashallah, 10 kids, whatever it is. She's missed 20 Ramadans. So are you going to say to her now at the age of 45 or 50, start making up 20 Ramadans? Start the tally chart and start doing 4 lines and then the 5th line across. Start doing it. The scholars, they said, that's such a burden. How are you going to tell her to do that? The Sharia would not make such a burden upon a woman. That's why the scholars who take the opinion of the fidya, they say it's a fidya. Because look at the complicated situation. So she only has to give fidya, she doesn't have to make it up. But that is, it's a likely situation, it can occur. But a lot of the scholars, most of them seem to have the opinion, because of the logic that it's ultimately not a permanent issue. And it's ultimately a temporary issue. Because most women are not going to be in that situation. They're not going to be 20 consecutive Ramadans. There could be maybe 2 or 3 Ramadans, and then they're not pregnant, or they're not breastfeeding, or the kids have grown up and they don't have another pregnancy. Most women are not going to have Ramadan after Ramadan after Ramadan consecutively. So why should they be giving fidya? Shouldn't they just make up then in between those years when they're not pregnant or breastfeeding? Why are they getting the excuse? If we're going to say fidya, maybe the fidya should only be for women who really are in that situation of consecutive Ramadans. But then the problem is a woman's never going to know if she's going to be in the future into consecutive Ramadans. So the fidya ruling could be problematic. It's an opinion that exists though. But a lot of the scholars, a lot of them have the opinion that she's got to make up. There's a lot more detail to it than that. There is a lot more detail. The Malikis, the Shafi'is, the Hanbalis, the Hanafis, they have a lot